Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about web content management, and particularly I want to share with you some of the findings that we've discovered over quite a number of different web content management implementation projects. We were very lucky to have a project where we were able to compare some web content management systems side by side. So I just want to share that knowledge with you and just explain what there is out there for you to use when you're thinking of Alfresco for web content management. So my name's Charlie Halford. I'm an architect at Ixxus. Ixxus are a global systems integrator, so we work with Alfresco, we work with Drupal, MarkLogic, and a number of other open source projects. So what we're going to cover in this talk today is we're going to go over the definition of web content management. So that often means a lot of different things to different people. So we'll talk about specifically what we're on about when we say WCM. Then we're going to go through Alfresco's history with web content management. So they've had a number of different strategies over the years. So we'll go through what they began with and where we are now. Then we'll move into why you might want to use Alfresco as a web content management system, or why you might want to use it to store your content in a web content management system. Then we're going to go into a comparison through a number of different WCM options. So I'm going to go through a bit of custom development. I'm going to talk about Alfresco's current offerings, and then we're going to go through Drupal, Liferay, and Crafter, and explore how we integrated them, what the issues were, and what the opportunities were. And then I'll wrap up with some conclusions and talking about the future. So what do I mean when I say WCM? So this space has a huge number of different acronyms, and they've changed over time. So what you see there, we've got ECM, CMS, DMS, WCM. So if you ask a pure Drupal person or a pure WordPress person, they'd probably say they're a content management system. Right? So it's important that we understand what we're talking about when we say WCM. So ECM is enterprise content management. So we generally see this acronym used when we're talking about documents, similar with DMS, document management system. So there are so many acronyms, we really need to cut it down. So the definition I'm going to use for this presentation: a WCM is a system designed to manage content intended for delivery to a web browser. Now, that's not to say that any web content management system can't deliver elsewhere. Many systems will deliver to a number of different devices and publication channels. But when we say WCM, we're talking specifically about web delivery. So a web content management system can include a number of different services. So one of these, pretty core to the delivery of web content, is templating. So as you can see here, I've just included an example of what templating might allow you to do. So we're splitting a page up into different sections. We're deciding where we want to deliver content. We're deciding where to place some of the important functionality in the site. It includes navigation, headers, and some personalization as well. So most web content management systems you look at will include an aspect of templating. And the key part to templating in a WCM is normally that it's accessible to people that don't need to dive very deeply into the system they're developing on top of. So if I'm a Java web content management system, I might provide a templating system that is accessible to front-end developers, so that we don't have to have a complete set of skills for that single system just to implement a template. So that's pretty key in web content management systems. Another section of services that web content management systems will tend to deliver is the concept of user-friendly editing. So when I'm editing a bit of content, the key part I want to engage with is users. I want to enable collaboration. So the most crucial thing to enabling collaboration is to make all of the processes of working with that content, so that's consuming it, editing it, creating it from scratch, deleting it, so the whole concept of management, I want to make those things as easy as possible. So editing is one of those use cases. And here you can see an extension of that, so the idea of inline editing. So a user finding a piece of content on a web page and not having to switch context. And by switching context, I mean they don't have to go to some completely different system. They can edit the content as they see it in that web page. So a number of web content management systems are going to go over, have this capability, and it's really all about enabling the user to do their job better. So when I talk about contextual editing, there are a number of different things you can look at. So in context editing is normally used when we're talking about keeping ourselves inside the same system, so inside the same user interface, but giving somebody an edit screen to modify the fields, so making them happy in the system that they're used to using. So part of this is about ensuring that when we develop a new system or we implement a system for a user base, we don't always want them to go through a huge amount of training, a huge amount of relearning. We actually want them to be able to use tools that they're used to. A vast number of users are very used to using websites and using web-based forms to create content, to interact with websites. But we can also extend that into other areas. So we've also looked at areas where we can add contextual editing into things like Adobe InDesign, which is a tool used in publishing for laying out graphics, laying out different documents. And we've also looked at using Microsoft Word to enable people to edit content in a place they feel most comfortable. So it's all about experience at this point, helping users to do their jobs better. One of the other key parts of a web content management system is enabling collaboration. So we want users to be able to look at the system and collaborate with other users. So we want them to ensure that their content is essentially as good as it can be. So that might be one person creating a bit of content and then another person looking at it down the road, editing a bit of it, making sure it looks correct. It might be running it through an approval process and ensuring that people can work together effectively. Because at the end of the day, getting people to work together is more likely to produce high quality content and better work. So there are a number of other services that web content management systems will provide, but I just wanted to highlight those ones as some of the key ones. And so we're going to move now into looking at what Alfresco has been doing with web content management. So this diagram that I've stolen from one of my colleagues shows the kind of history of where web content management has gone through. So at the top here we've got Alfresco being released initially, and then along the time of Alfresco 2.0 being released, we've got the AVM coming in. So the AVM was a repository that a lot of people use to deliver web content. So people would build applications on top of the AVM, enabling them to deliver content to end users. And then side by side with that, we have the document management repository, which we typically use inside Share today. So around Alfresco 3.0, we get Share. Share allows us to collaborate a lot easier with our users, allows us to look at our content in different ways, and gives us a new interface. So as we move into Alfresco 3.4, a new web content management API is announced, and that's Web Quick Start. So Web Quick Start is essentially a foundation for building websites in Alfresco. It provides a number of out-of-the-box services that let you deliver content to end users. And it also provides, I think it's 2 implementations of what an example website might look like if you're using Alfresco for web content. Then we move on, and around February 2012, the AVM becomes deprecated, so new implementations are no longer recommended. And we start to hear Alfresco recommend Drupal and Liferay and other web content management systems for implementation. And then alongside this, we also have the CMIS initiative. So CMIS is a content management interoperability. So essentially, it's a standard that that helps us decouple Alfresco and many other content management systems. And in a web content management perspective, it allows us to deliver content from one tier to another, with a web content management system sitting at the front and another content management system sitting behind it. So why would we want to use Alfresco for web content management? So it provides a number of services out of the box. So we just briefly touched on CMIS. So CMIS is a huge effort, and it's a huge deal for web content management in particular, because it gives us that standard interface to talk to Alfresco from. So we can start to understand exactly where we want to integrate. We can limit our integration to one well-known standard, and then the idea is we could potentially swap out the systems on either side of this CMIS interface. So we could change our web content management system or change our background ECM if we wanted to. There are also the concept of web content services in Alfresco. I'm going to go over that in a minute. But there are a set of sets of functionality in Alfresco which really enhance the idea of web content management. And then we've got renditions and transformations, which are really key in some applications to delivering rich media to end users. And it's often an area where you find that traditional web content management systems might fall short. And I guess that's part of a theme I want to go over, which is when you are looking at your WCM options and you're thinking about implementing WCM, you need to understand where your split between the 2 systems is going to be. So Alfresco will often implement a number of pieces of functionality which is also covered by your web content management system, and vice versa. So when you go through the use cases and the requirements on your project, you really need to understand why it makes sense for a given system to implement them. And in the extreme sense, you need to understand why you might want to store your content in Alfresco as opposed to storing it purely in a web content management system. And I hope I'm going to help identify some of those points today. It's interesting to note that Alfresco's Drupal integration for the Summit website and forums.alfresco.com actually store their content in Drupal rather than in Alfresco, and then use a file-based mechanism to integrate. So if you want to go and download my presentation after this talk, when you click on that link to my presentation, it's actually going inside Alfresco to pull out that PDF or that presentation file. So that's where they've maintained a split. So it's really important to understand exactly where you want to see your content. Okay, so if we talk about CMIS, it's at its simplest level, it gives us a create, retrieve, update, and delete functionality. So it lets us work with content at a level that lets us just place pieces of content into a repository and retrieve them and do some of the basic bits of management around it. The CMIS spec also allows us to do a number of other things, but when we look at some of the CMIS integrations that I'm going to show you, this is really the basis of it. So when CMIS was created, it had three primary use cases in mind. So R2R was repository to repository, A2R was application to repository, and the third one was a federated use case. So R2R is what we're thinking about here. So a web content management system on the front end, and behind that, an Alfresco repository containing some or all of our content. The application to repository use case was more typically around the idea of desktop applications being able to integrate with CMIS. So I don't know if anybody's used the LibreOffice application, but that has an integration with CMIS that allows you to edit documents from inside the desktop application over CMIS. And federated is more around the idea of understanding that you have a number of different repositories that could store different bits of content and being able to search over them and retrieve documents over all of those federated repositories. So the next point I want to go over when we talk about web content management systems on the front end is the idea of dynamically retrieving content. So I like to think of this concept as a spectrum. So you'll often find people have different ideas of how web content should be delivered. So on an extreme end of a spectrum, you might have people that expect all content to be dynamically retrieved from some underlying database and then served to an end user on demand. So that's typically the fastest paced end of the spectrum, where edits to content will instantly appear in users' browsers, and the speed of content updating is very fast. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have an idea of channel-based delivery. So sometimes this idea of static delivery, where we essentially assemble the content beforehand into how the content might look finally, so a rendered page of HTML, for example, and then deliver that to the end user. So that typically tends to be a little slower, but often gives us significant performance gains. So another part of Alfresco that really helps us for a web content management system is the idea of content services. So one of the key parts of Share is the collaboration. So I've not yet experienced a web content management system that gives you the level of collaboration that Share gives you. There's a huge array of options. There's commenting, there's revisions, there's workflows that put you into a review. So there's a lot of options there. And if you want to store your content in Alfresco, that's very, very compelling. There's also the content publishing framework that lets you take your content and push it out to existing channels. So if you wanted your content to essentially, if you wanted your web content to just be one channel, you could also deliver to things like Facebook, Twitter, and other integrated services using Alfresco. Another really key part is the idea of renditions. So here I've shown multiple versions of the same file being transformed into different sizes so that we can deliver the right image to the right platform. So if we've got an iPhone with a Retina display, for example, we could use Alfresco's back-end services to transform that into a very high-quality version of the image and then deliver that to the user on request. And you'll often see that this is really where a lot of other web content management systems fall short. They don't have this capable framework. Okay, so now I want to go over some of the options that we see with web content management systems. So I'm going to talk about how you might approach a custom implementation project and show a brief sample architecture. Then we'll talk about Web Quick Start, what the options are at the moment. And then we're going to go through and look at Drupal, Crafter, and Liferay. Okay, so that's in the wrong order. But Web Quick Start is created with 3.4 of Alfresco. And it provides an example implementation of a couple of websites. It essentially serves as a platform for you to deliver your own content from. but one of the key parts is it is only a framework. It doesn't give you any out-of-the-box templates to, any out-of-the-box templating system that helps you deliver new websites. It doesn't have a concept of modules, and essentially you are limited to a set of APIs which will deliver content for you. You have to do the rest. So a web quick start gives you that initial kind of shows you initially how to do it, but then expects you to develop a complete website on top of that. And then recently, Web Quick Start has essentially met its goals. So by that I mean it's unlikely to receive any significant new development. Web Quick Start essentially has done what it needs to do. It provides you that website out of the box. It will be updated in terms of support and maintenance, but that's as far as it's going to go as a platform. So if we then move on to the idea of a custom implementation, so in terms of all of the different options you might have when you're delivering a web content management system, a custom one is easily the most flexible, right? So you might have a huge array of Java developers that are already involved with Alfresco delivery, and a custom one obviously doesn't have to be based on Java, but can help you reuse a lot of those skills, and that's where we've seen a lot of people, some of the strong motivations behind a custom development will be to reuse those skills. Additionally, custom developments, unsurprisingly, tend to happen where the requirements for a web content management system are really specific, where they don't tend to cover, out-of-the-box products don't tend to cover some of the specific requirements, and it might cost more to add those bits of functionality in than it might to deliver a custom solution. So it gives you a number of different architectural options. So we talked about dynamic and channel-based delivery. From a custom point of view, you could essentially do anything you wanted. You could deliver final rendered HTML to the user, or you could do it in a much more dynamic approach. So here's an example of how you might look at a custom web content management architecture. There's hundreds of thousands of different ways you can do this. I just wanted to highlight how it's been done, how you could do it. So essentially we've got Alfresco sitting behind here as our system of record, which is essentially where all of our content is edited. It's pushed into our web content management system, and then we've got CMIS sat there ready to integrate with the downstream. And then that content can then be pushed into a delivery tier or an engine in the middle, and then pushed from there into a front end, which would then use some of these ideas like templates to provide the website to the end user. So you kind of get an idea of what you can do in a custom architecture. So now I'm going to talk about Drupal. So I talked before about the fact that we had the chance to do this implementation where we got 3 identical looking websites up and running. And at the end of when we finally delivered it, the client was actually a bit surprised by how similar all of the websites ended up looking. But under the hood, of course, they were all very different, and they all took a variable amount of time to deliver. So that was quite key to understanding where things worked well and where they didn't. So Drupal essentially takes the dynamic end of the spectrum. So all content in Drupal is pulled from its internal database and served to a user through a number of templates. What Drupal is really strong at is this concept of dynamic site assembly. So when you talk about Drupal and you talk about Drupal skills, you start hearing this concept of a site builder. And a site builder in the Drupal world is somebody who doesn't necessarily have development skills or a development background, but can assemble a website completely from scratch and have a very capable website delivered to an end user. So to a lot of organizations, that's very compelling. It it allows for a lot of rapid application development or potentially prototyping. For those who saw Dries' presentation earlier, there are thousands of contributed add-ons. What did he say? I think it was 15,000, which is a ridiculous number. But that kind of gives you an idea of how much is available out of the box for Drupal. That definitely comes with a health warning, though. So 15,000 is a lot, but at one end of the scale, you might have an amazingly tested module that delivers a huge amount of functionality and gives you excellent performance and saves you hundreds of man days. The other end of the scale, you might have a module that initially looks good, but hasn't had any time put into it. The testing is poor, and it could potentially hurt the performance of your application. So you definitely start seeing this concept of vetting modules come up, where you look at modules to analyze how viable they are for your project. Drupal's huge community is also a boon, so having all of those people that are willing to help out with Drupal problems, support, is a massive help. And it also means you have a huge number of eyes looking at all of the code going into Drupal, which helps you out. There's also commercial support available as well. And Drupal also has excellent theming support. Because it's got thousands of contributors, because it's so popular, there's a lot of skills in the theming area, and the theming support does make it accessible to non-developers. So I just wanted to demonstrate a UI that had been built with Drupal. So this is the Twitter developer API site built in Drupal. Dries talked about whitehouse.gov. So the actual design itself isn't hugely relevant. I'm sure you could replicate that anywhere. But what I wanted to point out is just the idea that a lot of the components on this website have actually just been pulled from modules that are already existing in the Drupal development setting. So here we can see a number of RSS blogs being delivered into the front end, and also the fact that Twitter isn't a primarily PHP or Drupal-based organization, yet they decided to choose Drupal for delivering a website. So what problems and what opportunities did we have when we delivered our Drupal integration? So Drupal has a CMIS module, which is great. So we talked about CMIS. So it's very useful when you're developing an integration. So the two parts of the CMIS module are sync and views. So views essentially allows you to expose a number of files in your front end and then give users the ability to click on them and download them directly from Alfresco. So that's very powerful, but for our particular use case, we wanted to explore how storing content in Alfresco would help us, because once we had content in Alfresco, we had access to a huge number of Alfresco's back-end services. So we wanted to make use of those. So sync is the other part. So sync essentially lets you synchronize content from inside Alfresco directly into Drupal. The sync gives you this decoupling, so you essentially can ensure that Drupal operates on its own content. So you synchronize a bit of content into Drupal, and once it's in Drupal, Drupal can act on it as it would any other bit of content. So you decouple the two systems, and you don't, if you have hundreds of thousands of people hitting a Drupal website, you won't have hundreds of thousands of hits going to your Alfresco backend, and that can be quite powerful. So sync will take a given folder in Alfresco and synchronize the content into Drupal. Where did we see opportunities for Drupal? Specifically, the CMIS module lacks durability, some stability, and ease of configuration. So if you're after a completely transactional website where creating content in the front end always results in Alfresco having content created in the back end, then at the moment the CMIS module isn't perfect. It can still do with some durability improvements. I've actually missed out a fairly key feature of the CMIS module. It's also two-way. So if I create content in Drupal, that content can then be created in Alfresco and vice versa. Yeah, that was particularly useful for us because we wanted to enable users to only create and edit content in the Alfresco side, only create and edit content in the Drupal side, where the user experience could be more customized and potentially a lot better, and then have the management side of the content and the services side of the content all be handled from an Alfresco side. So that two-way sync is very important. As I talked about previously, contributed modules can vary in quality significantly. So really analyze how you select your modules and make sure the modules are both relevant and high quality. And CMIS on purpose doesn't provide any idea of workflow or approval. So if you want to integrate that idea into your Drupal-based website, you might find that you're going to start to need things like custom web scripts or using things like statuses on content to start modeling that idea. Okay, I'll moving on to Liferay now. So Liferay provides a sort of similar rapid application development environment to Drupal when we think about web content management, because it's a portlet system. So portlets are essentially bits of functionality that you can include in your web content management system. And those portlets are there because Liferay isn't just a web content management system, it's actually a huge project, which is essentially an enterprise portal. So you get a huge amount of functionality that comes along with it. So those portlets can be really quick. They definitely helped us when we implemented. We could pull together different portlets and present information to the end user really quickly. It's got a strong community and excellent commercial support. And as I said previously, it's got a complete set of Java services, which are really good to work with and allow you to customize it to quite a vast extent. And it also has some good theming support as well. So here's an example of a website implemented in Liferay. So Sesame Street. Just wanted to demonstrate the variety that some of these web content management systems can go to, even though the behind the scenes is very different. So when we looked at Liferay integration, we found it had CMIS out of the box. That's great. But the CMIS integration only had one mechanism, and that was as a file repository. So the ability to see files from Alfresco inside Liferay. So the concept of web content in Liferay is a very different thing. It's not a file in Liferay. Web content is a very specific type. So displaying that web content from Alfresco into Liferay required some quite significant customization. So that's definitely an area where we'd look to improve. So some of the opportunities we'd seen are CMIS doesn't support content sync. Its out-of-the-box workflow can duplicate some of Alfresco's services. So we talked previously about the services in Alfresco that are really useful, and the fact that we have this balance, this overlap, and understanding where our balance is. So in Liferay, we needed to use some of that workflow to model the idea of approve and reject on content. But ideally, I think with Liferay, you'd want to sit the workflow behind the application and have it execute from Alfresco. So you want to avoid that kind of duplication. And then finally, Liferay itself is a huge, fairly heavyweight application, and it is fairly expensive as well. So it can be quite a heavyweight solution to your WCM problem, but it really depends on your use case. Okay, now I'm going to move on to Crafter. So Crafter I think they had a session earlier on today. So I'm going to describe some of the the experiences we had when we implemented Crafter. Crafter is a hugely integrated application. That's one of its great strengths when we went into delivering our WCMs, was that it required very little Alfresco customization. It's essentially a layer on top of Alfresco. It's a customization of the user interface in Alfresco. So if you've got a lot of people that are skilled in Alfresco, or they're used to the Alfresco interface, Crafter is a very, very good choice, and it's very powerful. And it comes with a number of out-of-the-box publishing workflows. So you don't have to implement those from scratch. There's the concept of going live on a certain date, so you can set a date in the future where you want your news article to go live and have it deliver further down the line. And it's an example of a web content management system that's perhaps more the channel end of the spectrum, whereby approved content is edited and previewed inside Alfresco, and then it's published out to a delivery engine once that approval process is complete. And finally, the Crafter interface offers in-context and in-place editing, which can be really powerful. Here's an example of the Crafter interface, showing you different editing mechanisms. So we've got our workflow here, so there's our in progress. We can edit, delete, schedule it to go live. We can go live now. It also has the concept of personalization, so it can deliver content to users depending on what it identifies as their persona. And it also has quite a powerful previewing mechanism, which not only allows you to preview it in the browser, but it also shows you what it looks like in an iPhone or a tablet. So it can be pretty useful. From an integration perspective, there's not much to say. It's already fully integrated. It augments share with a complete editorial user interface. And it gives you a hierarchical model to your content. So whereas Drupal and Liferay treat content as essentially independent objects that are tied together by tags and categories, Crafter very much takes a hierarchical model where a website is structured in a number of levels with pages at different levels in that hierarchy. And again, all of this is really important when you look at the use cases of your application, because different users will have different concepts of how they want web content to be organized and how they want it to be delivered. So that can be very useful for some people. It's out-of-the-box workflows control how content is published, which saves a load of time. And it also has multi-tier delivery, so the ability to customize the Crafter architecture to deliver how you want to deliver is very powerful. Some of the opportunities that we found in Crafter when we implemented was that the workflows weren't customizable out of the box. So they definitely required some time to customize, and that wasn't ideal. Its complex architecture can be difficult to deploy and maintain, but I guess that's one of those things that is more of an initial startup problem. And then finally, probably the most significant one when we're comparing them to Drupal and Liferay is, while the templating in Crafter is fairly similar to Drupal and Liferay, there's no support in developing the end functionality for the website. You're essentially left to your own devices in terms of having to write all of the code required to deliver an end website, whereas Drupal and Liferay might provide you with a number of modules out of the box to get you started. So I just wanted to go over a quick slide comparison. So here you can see Drupal. So its Alfresco integration isn't great. The CMIS module has some opportunities around it, but it's a fairly good start. It's got a huge number of features, and the website assembly speed is very, very rapid. Crafter, the Alfresco integration is completely built in. But the assembly speed of a website for somebody that's coming into Alfresco from scratch is relatively slow. And then from a Liferay perspective, the integration was easily the worst. but it is a huge portal which might meet more of your enterprise's needs than a number of the other systems. So what is the future? What do we want from Alfresco, web content management systems, and CMIS, and how do we deliver to multi-channels? So from Alfresco, I guess what we're starting to need as web content management is moving away from Alfresco is more of those services, more of those targeted abilities to consume Alfresco services from other applications. And we really want those in a standard way so that we can enable this decoupling from the different systems. From WCMs, I think Dries' talk previously was interesting in that he talked about web experience management, so moving more into personalization, integration, and delivery of the whole experience rather than just content. And CMIS, again, CMIS 1.1 includes a browser binding now, so when we get that, I think that will be particularly powerful for WCM as well. And finally, multi-channel. We talked pretty exclusively about web content management here, but a number of these WCMs also include APIs. So they allow you to deliver content to lots of different applications, like iPhone applications, Android applications, and lots of others. So when you're choosing a web content management system, how do we guide you? What do we do? You've really got to look at what's best for you and what's best for your users. So what's best for you? What does your architecture look like? Is Alfresco already in your solution? What are you using Alfresco for? So this bit's pretty key. So you really need to be sure what role Alfresco plays in your solution to understand where it delivers the most value. Because if you're not careful, you could end up using a number of services in your web content management system that are duplicating those in Alfresco, and they could be duplicating them badly. So you really need to understand exactly why you're using Alfresco. And then where does a given feature fit in? So I talked about workflow previously. Does workflow fit into the front end? Does it fit into a web content management system, or does it really live in Alfresco? From a compliance perspective, some people often want workflows, audits to happen in Alfresco because it tends to be the more supportable platform, and it tends to form the center of people's content strategy. And then finally, keep the user first. Essentially, if you want to develop solutions that are going to be adopted by the users, you need to ensure that you're doing all you can to make their experience as good as possible. So an example of this is providing, enabling users to edit content in context rather than forcing them to use a different system. So that's very important. So finally, web content management is awesome because you get to see the value that your content delivers to end users, which is really, really compelling when you do see it. And Alfresco is a really, really powerful system for underpinning web content management systems, and also for underpinning your content strategy as a whole. Drupal, Crafter, Liferay, Custom, Web Quick Start, there are many, many options with web content management, so really approach your project with an open mind and have a look at everything that's out there. And one size does not fit all. Drupal might be great for one user, where Crafter might be great for another one. There's no single web content management system that I've seen covers all requirements. So thank you very much, and if you've got any questions.
Okay, one question. In the AVM web projects, one really nice feature is the snapshots and being able to roll back. Do Drupal, Crafter, Liferay provide any services similar to that? Like you mentioned versioning in the beginning, and I'm assuming you're meaning the file versioning available in Alfresco.
Yes.
But beyond that, is there anything similar?
Okay, so by snapshotting, let me get it clear. So by snapshotting, we mean not just versioning a single file, we mean versioning an entire tree of a website.
Yep.
Okay, so no is the simple answer to that. So Crafter probably offers the closest to that. So you've got a hierarchy and you've got versions against each file in that site, but it doesn't offer that hierarchical versioning model. And Drupal and Liferay certainly don't.
Yeah. And that's a real shame because especially if you've got critical websites, like I'm from a university, and students can appeal things based on what they saw on a particular website on a particular day.
On a particular day.
Yes.
Yeah. It is very powerful. It's difficult when you talk about the AVM and how it's been used previously, because it is a very powerful tool, and it does enable a number of use cases that these web content management systems don't. I can imagine you could go ahead and implement that kind of thing in one of these systems, but I'm not Alfresco product management. I can't really talk to why they've retired that. One over there.
Which was your favourite?
Depends what I was.
Is it no comment?
No, it depends. I think from an integration perspective, Crafter was awesome. It let us do the most. From a front-end skills perspective, Drupal was really good because it let us use, it was the quickest to develop, and it let us use skills which were, I guess, you didn't need as much development knowledge to use them, which was really powerful. But it didn't have as many features as Crafter or Liferay in terms of from a Java perspective.
Thank you.
Yep, one at the back.
Where do they stack up on a sort of cost basis against each other? So cost to implement or like license fee or something like that?
Okay, so from a license fee perspective, Liferay #1, Crafter #2, Drupal #3. That's in terms of highest. So Liferay is quite expensive. From an implementation perspective, I'd say Liferay was the heaviest in terms of development because it required so much customization in terms of the integration with Alfresco. If you implemented it from scratch and didn't touch Alfresco, you'd be doing, your development wouldn't be huge. But out of the box, that integration just wasn't there. And then Drupal, actually the majority of our time in Drupal was 1, dealing with workflow, and 2, dealing with the CMIS module, the sync in the CMIS module. But those 2, everything else in Drupal happened really, really quickly. So those 2 were the 2 biggest issues, whereas the other content management systems required a lot of implementation throughout the stack. I'm stopping everyone from having a drink. Thank you very much. Cheers.